If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I prepared especially for you. The gun smoke still hung in the street like a haze that would not lift. The wooden boards of the saloon were splintered from stray shots. The sheriff's office door hung crooked on one hinge, and blood pooled in the grooves of the dirt road where men had fallen. Horses stood restless at the hitching posts, their ears flicking at every sound, still smelling the violence that had just ended. The cowboy stood near the edge of the square, his revolver heavy in its holster, his shoulders tense from the fight. He had been drawn into it unwillingly. First just watching from the porch of the feed store, then forced to pick a side when bullets cut through the crowd. The men who fell by his hand had been outlaws, men who had been raiding ranches in the territory. But that gave him little comfort. Killing never gave him comfort. His name was Daniel, though most people never used it. He had drifted west after serving in the war, carrying scars both on his body and in his head. He had lost his brother in a border skirmish and hadn't spoken to his family back east since. The towns he passed through were just places to sleep and places to leave. He never intended to stay. The woman they brought forward was no stranger to violence of this land. She was young but carried herself with a defiance that made her look older. Her wrists were bound tight with rope, her long black hair tangled, her face streaked with dust. She was Apache, and the men dragging her forward spoke of her as if she were nothing but a prize of war. The sheriff said she had been found near the outlaws' camp, taken when her people had scattered. The town elders declared she should be given to a man who had done the most in the shootout. That man was Daniel. Daniel felt the weight of every eye in the square. The people wanted to see if he would accept her, if he would take what they were calling a reward. He studied her face, saw the fury burning behind her grief. Her chest rose and fell in quick, sharp breaths, but she made no sound. She did not beg. She did not curse. She only stared at him as if daring him to make her fate worse than it already was. Inside, Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He had killed to end bloodshed, not to claim someone's property. The memory of his brother came back. The way he had been left behind in the dirt, powerless, and the thought of doing to someone else what had been done to his own family filled him with anger. He kept hidden behind his silence. He did not want her bound, did not want her handed over like a sack of grain. He drew his knife, not quickly, but slow enough that the crowd could see his choice. He stepped toward her, and she stiffened, her eyes narrowing, bracing for another insult, another act of control. Instead, he cut the rope from her wrists. The frayed ends dropped to the dirt. For a moment, she rubbed her raw skin, as if not believing it was true. Daniel took his canteen from his saddle, unscrewed the top, and handed it out. The square was silent, except for the creak of a wagon wheel in the distance. She hesitated, then took the tin cup he poured into. She drank, her lips trembling from thirst, though her eyes never left his face. The elders looked confused, some disapproving. One muttered that he had been given a gift and didn't know what to do with it. Daniel ignored them. He hadn't come here to collect gifts. He had come west to keep moving, to keep away from people and their debts. But now he found himself standing with someone who had been thrown into his path by force. He did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him. But in that moment, something had already been decided. He would not leave her in this town, not with men who saw her as spoils. And though he did not yet understand why, he knew he could not turn away. The day wore on, the sun sinking lower as Daniel and the Apache woman moved past the town's borders, the empty street behind them a reminder of the shootout's violence. The air was thick with dust, and Daniel felt the weight of his decision pressing harder with each step. He didn't know why he couldn't leave her behind. He had nothing to offer her. Hell, he barely had enough for himself. He was used to traveling light, always alone, never staying in one place for long. But there was something in her eyes, something raw that spoke to a deeper part of him, a part of him that had been buried for a long time, the part that remembered what it meant to fight for someone else. The woman, whose name Daniel didn't know yet, walked silently behind him, her bare feet leaving marks in the dirt. She had refused to saddle on Daniel's horse, choosing to walk instead, her movements tense, as if every step might be her last. She never once faltered, even as the heat pressed down on them like a heavy blanket. Daniel's mind wandered back to the fight in town. The outlaws were dead, but so was part of him. Every bullet fired reminded him of what he had lost: his brother, his family, his purpose. It had been years since he had felt like anything more than a drifter, a man running from his past. But now, standing beside an Apache woman who had been cast aside, something had shifted. There was a bond between them that neither of them understood yet, but both felt. She had been given to him, handed over like cattle, but he couldn't see her as a prize. She was a survivor, just like him. By the time the sun began to dip behind the hills, Daniel had noticed her fatigue. Her pace had slowed, her steps heavy, as if the weight of the world pressed on her shoulders. The sight of her struggling stirred something inside him. He had no idea what had brought her to this point, whether she had been captured, traded, or forced into the situation. He had no answers. But he knew one thing: he couldn't leave her behind. They reached a small outcropping of rocks as the light began to fade. Daniel set up camp, his hands working mechanically as he unstrapped his gear and built a fire. The Apache woman sat a few feet away, her posture stiff, her face unreadable in the dimming light. Daniel sat across from her, his mind still swirling with questions. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his back, and he checked the chamber, his fingers moving like they had done 1,000 times before. He was used to being prepared, but now he didn't know what he was preparing for. The woman finally spoke, her voice rough from disuse, but clear. "Why did you free me?" Daniel looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the square. He had expected anger or hatred, but instead there was only curiosity, a rawness that mirrored his own confusion. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't done it out of pity, and he wasn't trying to be a hero. It wasn't even about the town's elders or their so-called reward. He had acted because something inside him had clicked. He didn't know her story, but he couldn't let her be treated like a piece of property. "I didn't free you to have you follow me," Daniel said slowly, his voice low. "I freed you because I couldn't leave you to be somebody's prize. I've seen too much of that." She didn't respond immediately, and the fire crackled between them, filling the silence with the occasional pop of burning wood. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I don't need your pity." Daniel's jaw tightened at the word, but he nodded. He understood. She didn't need to be saved. She didn't need anyone's pity. He wasn't trying to be a savior. But the truth was, he had no answers for why he had made that choice. "I don't pity you," Daniel said after a moment. "I don't even know your name." Her eyes flashed, but she didn't offer an explanation. Only a slight tilt of her head, as if the answer was irrelevant. The silence stretched on, both of them caught in the weight of their shared moment. They had both been survivors, in their own way. Her people had been hunted and scattered across the land, and his past had been nothing but a string of failed attempts to outrun his own ghosts. But there was something different now. A shift, a bond. Daniel stood, breaking the silence. "Get some rest. We leave early tomorrow." She didn't respond, but the tension in her body had eased slightly. She made no move to get closer to him, but the distance between them seemed to shrink just a little. As the night deepened, they both lay down under the stars, but neither of them fell into deep sleep. The air was still too heavy, too thick with the unspoken things between them. The days that followed were a blur of trudging through the arid desert. Daniel led the way, keeping his eyes peeled for danger while the Apache woman followed, her pace unsteady but determined. Each day, the sun seemed to burn them a little more, the earth beneath their boots growing harder and more unforgiving. She didn't ask about where they were going, and Daniel didn't offer. There was no plan, no destination, just the next step in an endless journey. They stopped when the sun became unbearable, resting under the thin shade of a mesquite tree. The woman, whose name Daniel still didn't know, sat with her back to the trunk, her eyes always scanning the horizon, waiting for something or someone. At midday, when the heat was nearly unbearable, Daniel handed her the canteen. She accepted it without a word, her eyes lingering on his face for a moment before she drank deeply. The silence between them was no longer strained, but it was still filled with questions neither of them was ready to ask. By the third day, the land had become even more unforgiving. The dry dirt stretched for miles in every direction, and the sun blazed down with an intensity that seemed to threaten to drain every ounce of life from the earth. Daniel led his horse forward, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of life, though he knew there wouldn't be much out here in the middle of nowhere. The Apache woman, still silent, followed him at a distance. She had not spoken a word since that evening by the fire, and though Daniel thought the silence would be unbearable, he found it oddly comforting. It was the kind of silence he had grown used to in his years of drifting, but now it felt different. With her, it wasn't just a distance to hide behind. It was a shared understanding, an unspoken agreement to keep moving, no matter what. The sky had clouded over that morning, and the air felt thick with the promise of rain. The dry earth had absorbed the moisture for so long that the wind picked up the dust and carried it into the air, making everything seem hazy and uncertain. By midday, Daniel knew that they were nearing a place where they could take shelter, but his horse had become sluggish under the weight of travel, and the woman's steps were slow, her feet dragging through the dirt. Daniel didn't ask if she was tired. He already knew she was. She hadn't complained once, but the look in her eyes told him everything. She was exhausted, and so was he. They both had been for far too long. "Rest here," he said, his voice carrying no trace of command, only simple fact. "We'll stop for a bit." She didn't hesitate, just nodded slightly, the only indication that she had heard him. She dropped her bundle beside a rock and sat down, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her face, though still hardened, was streaked with dirt and sweat, and her hair clung to her face in damp strands. Daniel took a seat on the opposite side of the fire pit. He quickly built, pulling out some jerky from his bag. Neither of them spoke as they ate in silence, the only sound the wind, which had picked up again, carrying the scent of dry sagebrush. They sat like that for a long while, not looking at each other, but neither turning away. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. "Where are you from?" His voice was rough, almost unfamiliar. He hadn't realized until now how much he had been avoiding talking about the most important things. Things like where they came from, where they were going, or why either of them even cared to travel this road together. She didn't immediately answer. Her fingers were tracing the edge of her worn sandal. The skin on her hands cracked and rough, and when she finally spoke, her words were slow and deliberate. "Does it matter?" Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was a statement more than a question. Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure if he had an answer for her. "Maybe not." She tilted her head slightly, a small, barely perceptible gesture. "I'm from the East," she said after a moment. "The tribe I was born into, they are no more. I have no family left. I have only the name my mother gave me before the raids took everything." She looked away from him then, her gaze lost in the vast emptiness of the desert, as if her words were more for the wind than for him. "What is your name?" Daniel asked, his voice softer now, more gentle than he had intended. She turned to him, her eyes unreadable. For a moment, there was hesitation, and then she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I am called Aylin." The name sounded like it belonged to the wind itself, quiet and fleeting. Daniel nodded slowly, his throat tight as he considered her words. The rest of the afternoon passed in a tense but necessary silence. The clouds that had once promised rain now hung heavy in the sky, threatening to burst but holding back, as if the desert itself was unsure of what it wanted to do. Daniel kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but his mind kept returning to the simple truth that he had no answers to the questions between them. What was he doing with her? Where was he taking her? Was she truly free to go her own way? The question lingered between them without being spoken, and the more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized he didn't know the answer. She wasn't a prize. She wasn't something to be won, nor was she something to be discarded. Aylin was a person, and for some reason she had ended up with him on this road. He couldn't ignore that. As night began to fall, Daniel built a fire, and they sat around it, the flames dancing in the growing dark. He noticed that Aylin had begun to open up just a fraction. There was a subtle shift in her body language. She no longer looked at him with the same hardness. She didn't trust him, but she was no longer afraid of him either. They both lay under the stars that night, and though the wind had cooled, the fire kept them warm. Daniel lay wide awake, listening to the crackle of the flames and the distant sounds of the desert. He knew that tomorrow would bring more uncertainty, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. Maybe it was because, for once, he wasn't alone. The following morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the world in hues of gold and orange, Daniel packed up their camp with careful hands. Aylin had already started to gather her things, her movement stiff but purposeful. They hadn't said much to each other since the night before, but there was something unspoken between them now, something that bound them together without the need for words. As they mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Daniel glanced at her once more. She was watching him, her eyes steady, and for the first time since they had crossed paths, he didn't feel like he was leading her. They were walking side by side now, both of them treading the same road, though neither knew where it would lead. The days blurred together as they continued their journey through the arid landscape. Each morning, the sun rose like a promise of heat and dryness, and each night, the desert seemed to swallow the stars whole, leaving behind only the faint glow of a distant fire. The bond between Daniel and Aylin continued to grow in silence, subtle but undeniable. Neither spoke of the things that weighed heavy on their hearts. Daniel's past, Aylin's exile, but they shared the same space, the same challenges, and somehow that was enough. Daniel, despite himself, had begun to think less of the road ahead, and more of what it meant to have someone walk beside him. There were still moments when he questioned his decisions, when he wondered whether it had been a mistake to bring Aylin along, to offer her something other than what the townspeople had handed her. But in those moments, he would look over at her, steady and unflinching, and those doubts would ease just a little. Aylin, on the other hand, had started to trust him in small ways. She still spoke little, but her actions were different now. She no longer flinched at the sound of his voice, nor did she watch him with the same wariness. Instead, she walked beside him, her pace matching his, her eyes no longer filled with distrust, but with a quiet understanding. Her pride had been tempered by the harshness of their journey, but it had not been broken. She was still Aylin, still strong, but she had begun to see Daniel not as a captor or a stranger, but as someone who had, in his own way, chosen not to leave her behind. The next day, as they crossed a dry riverbed, Daniel noticed a change in the air. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the wind, a change in the way the sky hung above them. The usual oppressive heat had tempered, and the land before them opened up, revealing a stretch of green, an oasis of sorts nestled between the dry hills. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was something promising on the horizon. This might be it, Daniel murmured, more to himself than to Aylin. He looked over at her, but her gaze was already fixed on the same sight. "What is it?" she asked, her voice rough in the days of silence. "A settlement," he said, his voice soft but sure. "We might find work here. Or something better." He wasn't sure what he meant by something better, but he had no words to explain the feeling growing inside him. This small patch of life in the barren wilderness felt like the first real place he could stop, like the first place that might offer them both a chance at something, anything, other than the endless dust of the road. They rode the rest of the way in silence, both of them wary but hopeful. As they approached the settlement, Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. It wasn't fear, but something like it, nervous anticipation, as if this moment, this decision, was somehow the last of its kind. The settlement was small but thriving, with a few families working the land and a handful of homes nestled against the creek. It wasn't a town, but it was a place that seemed to offer refuge, a place where the questions might not feel so pressing. They dismounted at the edge of the settlement, and Daniel took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how to proceed. Should he just walk in, ask for help, or offer their labor in exchange for shelter? But before he could make a decision, an older man approached them, his face weathered by years in the sun. "You two look like you've traveled far," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You looking for work?" Daniel nodded. "We're just passing through. Thought we might find some work here." The man looked them both over, his eyes lingering on Aylin for a moment longer than necessary. But there was no hostility in his gaze, just curiosity. "We can always use hands around here," he said finally. "We got fields that need tending and cattle to herd. And we've got room for travelers, as long as they're willing to work." Daniel didn't hesitate. Will work, he said, his voice firm. The man nodded, then looked over at Aelin, his expression unreadable. And her? Aelin stood still, her posture straight, but her eyes lowered. Daniel could feel the tension rise between them, the same old questions coming back. Could she work here? Would they accept her? Or would she be treated like she had been everywhere else? She's with me, Daniel said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of finality. She works just as hard as anyone else. The man didn't argue. He simply nodded and led them into the settlement. The days that followed were filled with hard work. Daniel and Aelin threw themselves into the tasks at hand, planting, clearing, mending fences, and helping with the cattle. The work was long, but it was honest, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he had found something that mattered. It wasn't redemption, not in the grand sense, but it was something real, something tangible. Aelin, too, found a rhythm in the work. Though she was still silent most of the time, Daniel noticed a change in her. The anger that had once burned behind her eyes had dulled, replaced by a quiet determination. She worked beside him every day, and though she didn't speak much, the bond between them grew stronger with every passing hour. She was no longer just a woman he had rescued. She was a person, someone who had chosen to stand beside him. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting the sky in fiery reds and oranges, Daniel found himself sitting on a rock by the edge of the creek. Aelin had finished her chores early that day and was standing nearby, watching the water. He hadn't planned on saying anything, but something in the air, in the stillness of the evening, made him speak. "You ever wonder what comes next?" he asked. Aelin didn't turn to him, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. "What do you mean?" she replied, her voice low. "Where do we go from here?" Daniel said, his gaze fixed on the water. "What do we do now that we've found a place to stay? What happens when the work is done?" For a long moment, Aelin didn't answer. Then, softly, she spoke. "I don't know," she said. I think it's about choosing what you want, not just surviving anymore." Daniel nodded. For the first time since he had left his family behind, he felt a weight lift from his chest. "Maybe we're not just surviving anymore," he said, his voice quiet. "Maybe we're finally living." Aelin turned to him then, her face calm but her eyes shining with something new, a spark of understanding, a recognition that had been absent for so long. "I think you're right," she said. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the sunset as the world began to settle into the quiet of evening. Neither of them had the answers, but for the first time, they didn't need them. They had found a place, together,